Dr. James Carleton Paget is Senior Lecturer in New Testament Studies here in Cambridge, and he's a Fellow of Peterhouse College. This morning, James will be asking the question, why bother with Albert Schweitzer?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event, which I hope will give us some ideas as to how to stimulate this organisation and move it forward. I'm going to ask what might seem to be the sort of central question, and I don't know whether I have straightforward answers, but nevertheless I'll set out what I think to be some of the major issues. In the 1940s and early 1950s, Schweitzer's fame was at its peak. A survey in Europe declared him to be a universal genius comparable to Leonardo da Vinci and Goethe. In a special feature of Life magazine, Schweitzer was called the greatest man in the world and the jungle philosopher. When he visited the United States for the first and only time in 1949, he was feted with Time magazine running a strikingly laudatory article on him. Numerous honours were bestowed upon him, culminating in the award of the Nobel Prize for 1952. He met or corresponded with most of the major figures of that period, including President Kennedy, Dag Hammarskjöld and others. And when, perhaps controversially, he decided to become involved in the anti-nuclear movement, his statements and thoughts were treated with great seriousness and indeed earned him quite bad marks, particularly from a number of Americans. Stained glass windows in churches and stamps bore his images. Schools, institutions and fellowships were named after him. And he even appeared in an interview in Playboy magazine. I have the copy but didn't think it would be right to distribute that. Although for reasons which I shall discuss later his reputation began to diminish towards the end of his life, his death was a world event acknowledged by heads of state throughout the world. Just a funny note here, most heads of state came out to acknowledge Schweitzer's death, but not in France, a country which of course he was a citizen of, but had a difficult relationship with him, and indeed Charles de Gaulle hated him because of his constant attacks upon de Gaulle's desire to have a nuclear weapon. And de Gaulle, being the kind of person he was, decided not to come out himself as the head of state and comment on Schweitzer, but rather sent out his Minister of Health. Schweitzer obviously being a doctor. The situation now is perhaps different. While Schweitzer remains a significant figure in German-speaking lands, and a recent survey indicated that in Germany 65% of children in schools had heard of Schweitzer and regarded him as a relatively inspirational figure. He is much less well known in Anglophone countries. I just want to make a few sort of anecdotal points on this. About 3 times now I have tried to run an extramural course at Madingley Hall in Cambridge, a weekend course on Albert Schweitzer, and have only ever attracted 2 or 3 people, and that's not regarded as economically viable, so we've never really been able to run that. You have a book going around here called The Restoration of Albert Schweitzer's Vision by the Serbian scholar Predrag Čečavaski. And I asked him whether that book that he had written, which after all is a relatively straightforward presentation of Schweitzer's ideas, and one that has a kind of a popular aspect to it, I asked whether he'd received any reviews, and he said the book hadn't been reviewed at all. Another thing that is striking is that C.H. Beck of Munich have published about 10 volumes of work that Schweitzer did not publish in his own lifetime, the so-called Nachlass. None of those volumes, and there's been no movement towards even trying to do this, have been translated into English, and though it seems to me some of them would, I think, change to some extent our views on Schweitzer. It came as a surprise to me then when Barack Obama was given the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize, rather surprisingly in 2009. Whether he'd receive it now is another question. But in 2009, with hopes high, he did. And in a notably humble address, he wondered why he'd been given it, particularly when such greats as General Marshall, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and Albert Schweitzer had been given it. In some senses, the decision of President Obama to mention Albert Schweitzer says more about President Obama than anything else. He is a person interested in theology. But it got me thinking, wherein lay the greatness of Albert Schweitzer. Why should we call Albert Schweitzer great, and why might his greatness continue to be relevant today? Now, in answering this question, I want to move through a number of possible responses, none of which, it seems to me, are mutually exclusive. I've arranged these in what I think is ascending order of importance, beginning with what some might take as the least significant reasons for bothering Schweitzer, to what some might see as the most important. Each one will be discussed quite briefly. The obvious way in which it can be seen, Albert Schweitzer's can be seen as interesting, one way, is simply his biography. The story of a brilliant young man who gives up his life to serve the sick and dying in Africa. It was one that Schweitzer, to some extent, encouraged in the way he wrote his own autobiographies and commented upon his life. The aspects of that biography have become more complicated, not least, it seems to me, with the publication of the letters between his future wife, Helene Breslau, and himself, which show that the route towards the decision to go to Africa was a much more complicated one, and is much more complicated the route that led him also to train as a medical missionary. So the decision was not, in some senses, immediate. In his German biography of Schweitzer, Niels O. Ehrman also questions the extent to which Schweitzer really gave up a brilliant career. Professor Rowland has made it clear that he was a brilliant New Testament scholar, but Ehrman argues in his book that Schweitzer his work never conformed to classic German scholarship, and there are some reasons for thinking that's true, and that in a way, Schweitzer never had a particular desire to pursue an academic career. He wouldn't really have made it, that's Ehrman's case. So the notion that he's giving things up is another thing. More recently, too, scholars who've come to look at Schweitzer's time in Africa more critically have argued that, of course, Schweitzer's own view of what he was doing was bound up to some extent with his own Nietzschean understanding of ethics as a form of self-fulfillment. And so Schweitzer's activity in Africa, far from being self-abnegation, has more to do with self-fulfillment. And not necessarily negatively, but the notion that there is this giving up of a brilliant career that involves Schweitzer in a denial of a significant part of himself needs, some people argue, to be revised. There is another way, however, in which his life is absorbing. The late Ben Pinrot, remember the biographer of Harold Wilson and the Queen, in a paper written some years ago, sought to address the question of how best to justify the writing of biographies against a backcloth of well-known objections. Drawing on his experience as a biographer, he argued that one of the principal justifications for the genre lay in using a life as a kind of prism through which one could, with some degree of intimacy, view the concerns of an age, microcosm becoming in some sense macrocosm. Though biography, I here quote, focuses on character, it is not ever about character abstracted from an environment, he wrote. On the contrary, it is character in an environment, and it is this that makes biography such a powerful and healthy form. The kind of biography that is worth reading and writing illuminates a changing environment by revealing the way a particular character interacts with it. At one level, such a justification for the writing of a biography of Schweitzer might seem odd. His life could be considered exceptional in many ways, and he was ever keen to emphasize his distance from the world in which he found himself. But these factors can be overemphasized, not least because no one is able to transcend the age of which they are a part, however much they may seek to do so. Schweitzer's life embodies in a variety of interesting ways the social, political, and intellectual tendencies of the time in which he lived. His identity as an Alsatian in the period following Alsace's annexation as a Reichsland incarnate the shifting contours of that disputed land's sense of cultural belonging, which would play out in interesting ways as Schweitzer's life advanced, and Alsace returned after World War I to being a part of constitutional France. The way in which Schweitzer distinctively embodies the liberal Protestant culture out of which he emerged and with which he continued to identify all his life. And indeed the way in which he reflects late 19th century liberal culture with its internationalist and related concerns. Also significant is the way Schweitzer exemplifies aspects of the philosophical culture to which he came, both in terms of his interest in Kant, German idealism, and a growing concern with Friedrich Nietzsche, who was to fascinate and revolt him all his life. Schweitzer is a distinctive expression of a kind of fin de siècle atmosphere, both in Germany and France, brought in by a number of factors, not least the growth of a kind of mass culture. Also significant in this context is Schweitzer's engagement with Africa and the ways in which he reflects the complex contradictions of European missionary involvement in that part of the world in the earlier and later parts of the 20th century, a point which we shall move on to discuss later in this talk. Schweitzer's involvement in the anti-nuclear movement of the 1950s and early 60s, at the behest of Albert Einstein and Linus Pauling, also raises fascinating questions about the response of a particular group of individuals to the threat of nuclear annihilation, and highlights the complex political, ethical and cultural tensions at the beginning of the Cold War, during which Schweitzer was to find himself exploited by both communists and capitalists alike. There is also another way in which Schweitzer feeds into and supports a Pimlottian view of biography, and that is the way in which he became an icon of sorts after the Second World War, and the way in which Lamborghini, in turn, became a symbol which transcended the particularity of its setting. In this context, the biographer is less concerned straightforwardly with the particularities of Schweitzer, and more with the ways in which he became a figure upon whom varieties of people could project their hopes and aspirations in the period after 1945, in the wake of a destructive and murderous war. His ongoing popularity in Germany and in German-speaking lands is very much bound up with this, it seems to me. But equally, in considering Schweitzer as icon, we should not just dwell on the use to which he was put positively, but the way in which as decolonisation began to become a reality and independence movements within Africa arose, Schweitzer, both because of his iconic status in the West and his own uncomplicated thoughts on decolonisation, became a hate figure both on the radical left in the West and also among African intellectuals and opponents of the colonial powers. Schweitzer then reflected the contested nature of a colonial past and present at a time of considerable change in ways which few other individuals at that time did. Bothering with Schweitzer because he is a promising subject for a biography, conceived as a means through which to view a particular time in history, perhaps presents a limited view of why we should be concerned with him. But it remains the case, I would suggest, that a biography of the kind suggested above remains a desideratum, the writing of which could help give more traction to those who believe, no doubt all of you here, why Schweitzer remains a compelling and intriguing figure, but a telling and intriguing figure within a particular context. There is something interesting about him because of the times in which he lived and the ways in which he both reflected those times and was himself projected upon. Okay, let's move now to intellectual achievements. To some, of course, Schweitzer is worth bothering with because of the diversity of his achievements, which was acknowledged even when he was a young man. And I remember that I first became interested in Albert Schweitzer at school when I was about 17, and Don Cupid, you may remember Don Cupid, he's still alive, in fact, and he did this television program, The Sea of Faith, and had a whole program devoted to Albert Schweitzer. It's about the last time that something like this happened in Britain, where there was a positive program about Schweitzer that lasted about an hour. And I remember being struck then by the sheer diversity of the things that Schweitzer got up to. The doctorates he acquired, the diverse subjects upon which he wrote, all of this is well known. But the question that arises is whether in itself this makes Schweitzer worth bothering with. After all, once one has taken one's breath in and marvelled at the proliferation of talents, and you might remember that when Schweitzer was offered an honorary degree at the University of Cambridge, the rather patrician committee that got together to decide this had a lengthy debate, I understand, about what kind of a degree they were to award him, after all, the diversity of activity. And eventually the then Master of Magdalen came up with the decision that he should be given a doctorate of laws for general excellence. What in fact then is the sum total of the parts of that achievement? After all, precisely because of the life he led, there is a sense in which much of what he wanted to achieve was never successfully accomplished. That, to quote one of his earlier and most acute biographers, Werner Paget, many of his intellectual projects lie as half-completed ruins, a point Schweitzer himself was to admit. He often says of his work, it is unvollendet, it's not completed. As Paget writes, The way to this heart of Schweitzer's activity passes through a heroic landscape dotted as though with erratic boulders. Some of them have never been completed, others have been left to crumble because the centre of this landscape, the jungle hospital at Lamborghini, took up progressively more and more of his time. In the different areas about which he wrote, what in fact was his contribution? I don't want to talk at great length about his work as a musician, partly because that's not something that I can talk about with a great deal of authority. But when I consult books on Bach, the latest book on Bach, I often go and look and see, and Schweitzer very rarely gets a mention. Speaking to musicologists, Schweitzer is acknowledged as having played a significant part in the interpretation of Bach at the time he wrote his work for various reasons. It was a kind of attack upon the famous work of Spitta on Bach, and the view of Bach as an absolute musician, and an almost Wagnerian interpretation of Bach as a poet. But beyond that, Schweitzer is not someone who is wrestled with in the way, for instance, that Professor Rowland has indicated he's wrestled with still, perhaps, as a New Testament scholar. And I want to say a little bit about that now. I'm going to rush over that because I think Professor Rowland, in fact, said a good deal that needed to be said. We've heard from Christopher Rowland something about his achievements as a New Testament scholar, with much of which I would concur. What remains clear to me is that in spite of the clear deficiencies in some of this work, not least in the more precise details which make up his account of especially the life of Jesus, and to a lesser extent the mysticism of Paul the Apostle, in purely scholarly terms, his achievements in this field have endured longer than his achievements in the other areas to which he contributed. A dull academic argument can be had about the degree to which Schweitzer's views on Jesus, for instance, were truly original, and whether in fact he misrepresented the work of Weiss in attempting to highlight his own distinctive contribution. There is, I think, something in this, and it should be remembered that initially Weiss's work was much better received than Schweitzer's, in Germany at least. Schweitzer's work was received extremely badly, and some very nasty reviews were written of it, hence Ehrman's point about the fact that he would fail to make an academic career in Germany at least. But it should be remembered that the force of Schweitzer's book lies not simply in the probably flawed reconstruction of Jesus' own ministry, flawed in terms of its specific details, and in the way in which he presses his own case with such relentlessness through a brilliant if tendentious retelling of the history of scholarship, but also in the way, as Professor Rowland indicated, he articulated the complex hermeneutical consequences of his findings, which led to an attempt to give an ethical rereading of eschatology and a new and startling picture of the Jesus, both alien and arresting. The fervour with which Schweitzer engaged in this task, urged on by a strikingly personal commitment to Jesus, is simply absent from Weiss, whose book ends in a hermeneutical whimper as he urges an interpretation of the kingdom of God, which is precisely the one he claims Jesus did not endorse. That is one of the strange things of Weiss's book. Its consequences are never played up by Weiss in the way that Schweitzer plays up the consequences of his book. Arguably, the book on Paul, however, is a greater achievement. The claim that the central conviction of Paul lies in some form of mystical union with Christ, rather than the doctrine of justification by faith, has had a huge effect upon scholarship, and that's all been well delineated. Of course, another interesting thing about Schweitzer's work is the degree to which, precisely because of that emphasis, but also for other reasons, he emphasises very strongly, and this applies to his work on Jesus too, the Jewishness of these people. That this is remarkable when you think of the scholarly tradition out of which he emerges. And I want to read one sentence on Paul, one section, which I think is extraordinarily prescient and important for the way that New Testament scholars go about their work today. For him, Paul, there was only one religion, that of Judaism. It was concerned with God, faith, promise, hope, and law. In consequence of the coming, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it became his duty to adjust its teachings and demands to the new era thus introduced. And in the process, many things were moved from the shadow to the light. Christianity is for Paul no new religion, but simply Judaism, with the centre of gravity shifted in consequence of the new era. His own system of thought is certainly no new religion for him. Again, as I say, this anticipates strong trends in current analysis of Paul, and not least current analysis of the New Testament in a post-Holocaust environment. Schweitzer wrote the Mysticism of Paul the Apostle in 1930, when he had long ceased to think of himself as an academic, or to consider an academic future as a possibility. He wrote the book because, as with almost all he wrote, he wanted to make a series of points which he thought were of actual and current importance. Schweitzer was not a typical academic. He never wrote an academic article. He never wrote an article in the Zeitschrift or something in particular. He was always writing books that he felt had something to say beyond the subject matter that was being addressed. While he was clear that Paul's eschatological world had disappeared, he was equally clear that the way in which Paul sought to give expression to the consequences of mystical union with Christ, especially its ethical consequences, was of lasting importance, not simply in the substance of those thoughts, but because they were arrived at through thought, as Professor Rowan said. There was, in spite of many anachronistic aspects, a significant and important residue of truth in Paul's theology, which could still be of use to the committed Christian. And this brings me to a small but significant point. Schweitzer remained a Christian theologian of sorts all his life, though he was reluctant to embrace that title. He never liked the title, Theologe. Didn't really like it. One of the last works he wrote was entitled The Kingdom of God and Christianity, Reich Gottes und Christentum, in which he attempted to show, through a partial repetition of his own biblically based works, how a thoughtful and rational Christianity, as well as a morally enthusiastic one, could emerge from a biblically inspired re-engagement with the idea of the kingdom of God. And he attributed great significance to this work. It only came out posthumously, but in letters to his great acolyte in Switzerland, Fritz Burri, he indicates how important this work is, as also he does in works to the more difficult Martin Werner. He wrote it as a partial response to the rise of Karl Barth's so-called dialectical theology, which in its heavy emphasis upon the revelation of God's word and the otherness of God, sought in a variety of ways to undermine the liberal theological tradition which Schweitzer himself, in an admittedly distinctive way, represented. The sense that reason, religion, and especially the Christian religion, were to some extent compatible, had been a deep-seated concern of Schweitzer for all his adult life, and he looked with alarm upon what he saw as a dangerous revivification of the primacy of dogma and a movement against reason exemplified in Barth and his followers. And it's interesting that Schweitzer has a relationship with the liberal scholar Adolf von Harnack towards the end of Harnack's life, which is really quite intimate and strong, and I think it's because they're both appalled at what they see in different ways. But Schweitzer's riposte was in the end fragmentary, even to some uninterestingly liberal. And for these reasons, with the exception of a few minor Swiss theologians, he never gathered round himself a school of followers. As a universalist of sorts, and certainly an idealist, Schweitzer had less time for the specificities of Christian doctrine, and by extension the Christian tradition. His theology, though inspired by parts of the New Testament, parts which he saw in some ways through the prism of his universalist vision, did not deal in the traditional categories of Christian theology: incarnation, atonement, redemption, resurrection, the last things. And this may explain why, as a theologian, in contradistinction to a biblical scholar, he has had very little influence. His achievement as a theologian will always be associated with his work as a biblical scholar, and in particular the brutal and acute way in which he raised questions about the difference between the New Testament's world and ours, and the manner in which that world can be appropriated in the here and now. Schweitzer disliked the description of himself as a theologian, as I've said, and preferred to see himself as a philosopher. Although Schweitzer will term reverence for life a form of ethical mysticism, and so give it a strongly religious coating, it is a concept which appears in works which are self-evidently philosophical, and Schweitzer never attempts consciously to bring together his work on the New Testament and his philosophical ideas, though he was clear, A, that Jesus' love command, when universalized, would end up in something like reverence for life, and B, that religions, insofar as they were ethical, had much to contribute to thought. When you look at Albert Schweitzer's work on other religions, I'm not going to go into, let's say, other religions, for reasons other than Christianity, which were mainly work on Indian and Chinese religions. He only had rather negative things to say about Islam and didn't really bother with Judaism, because he felt that much of Judaism and Christianity kind of coagulated. He's principally interested in those religions for how they contributed to thought. Religion and thought, religion and philosophy should not be seen as aliens in a battle of subjects. He saw them as much closer. Be that as it may, Albert Schweitzer, the conscious Christian theologian, rarely allied with Schweitzer, the conscious philosopher. Now, this in contrast to his young contemporary, Rudolf Bultmann, who was quite clear that it was important to take Heideggerian existentialism and apply it to the New Testament. It was quite clear that there was a grand project. Schweitzer never engaged consciously in a grand project that brought philosophy and theology together. As a philosopher, Schweitzer is by and large ignored And even those mainly German but some non-German philosophers who have written extensively about his philosophy admit this point. There are a number of reasons for this. Some lie in Schweitzer's own way of writing. He is not always terminologically precise. Some lie in his use of terms like reverence, as in reverence for life, ethical mysticism, which sit uneasily in normal philosophical discourse. Some also lie in Schweitzer's strong critique of philosophy as he saw it being presently conducted. Philosophers have ceased to be guides to a wider public on the central questions related to how we should live, and have become professionals caught up in the history of their own subject and beholden to a more fragmentary vision of the purpose of philosophy. Some also lie in the fact that Schweitzer's own way of doing philosophy was generalising, if one might put it that way, rather than closely analytical. He tends to talk about Kant or Hegel in general terms. He doesn't concentrate on specific passages and analyse them closely. This was in part because he was committed to a way of doing philosophy which was tailored to the needs of the ordinary person. In a wonderful letter to Fritz Burri, he says, I don't like Karl Jaspers. I don't like him for all sorts of reasons. One of the main reasons why I don't like him is that he writes dreadfully. He says, when you write, the washerwoman should be able to understand. And it's a sort of strongly expressed view. And though concern with the opinions of professional philosophers was less taken up with that issue, there are also striking weaknesses in Schweitzer's own ideas about reverence for life. The most obvious of which lies in his strongly expressed view that a sense that we are wills to live, living amidst other wills to live, will lead us as a necessity of thought to the view that we should advance all forms of life rather than destroy them. As one German scholar has written, why should the realisation that I am life that wills to live amid life that wills to live compel me to promote and preserve the life of others? Is it not precisely the brutal struggle for survival and my attempt to assert myself in the struggle the fitting consequence of the fundamental experience invoked by Schweitzer? Is not the life that is affirmed precisely that of devouring or being devoured? Similarly, people have criticised Schweitzer for presenting a philosophy which is as simple in its conception, preserving life is good, destroying it is bad, as it is difficult in its practical implementation. In this sense, Schweitzer's absolute ethics does not offer norms for the solution of ethical conflicts in individual cases. These observations about Schweitzer's standing as a philosopher, together with comments on some apparent shortcomings in his own philosophical work, need not, however, mean that he is not worth bothering with as a philosopher. I want to set out a number of reasons in support of this claim. The first is that Schweitzer was a public philosopher. He was someone committed, in some sense, to philosophy as a public discourse. He attacked philosophy, aspects of philosophy since Descartes, believing that questions such as can we prove that the external world exists, can we prove that there is an interaction between body and soul, is cogito ergo sum the first act of consciousness, were not questions truly relevant to the way people lived. And it's interesting that in 1934 in Oxford, he met the great philosophical scholar Ernst Cassirer and his wife. And Cassirer had just left Germany because he was Jewish and was about to go to the University of Göteborg in Sweden. And obviously the times were very difficult ones, and Schweitzer he was giving the Hibbert lectures, and he gave a typical Schweitzerian lecture, and obviously Cassirer was very moved. And in his Antrittsvorlesung, his inaugural address as the professor at Göteborg in Sweden, Cassirer discussed the difference between philosophy, and he took up here Kantian distinctions, between a philosophy as a Schulbegriff and a Weltbegriff. Philosophy is as basically a technical subject which involves strong technical and subtle arguments as a specialism in a way, and philosophy is something that can be applied more widely, that a wider public can understand as a Weltbegriff. And using Schweitzer as an example, Cassirer to some extent castigated himself for not taking this seriously enough. So I think, I suppose this applies to all areas of Schweitzer's life. Schweitzer as a public intellectual, who of course is devoted to carrying out what he says, is a powerful image, and it comes across, it seems to me, particularly in his philosophical writings. Schweitzer's philosophy is a response to human thoughtlessness in the face of incomparable industrial progress, which has created the possibility of huge destruction and a dangerous mass culture. That's a big theme for him. Such a set of circumstances can only be properly addressed, he says, through careful ethical reflection. And yet Schweitzer notes a kind of blind approval of progress and a comparable deficiency in ethical reflection, vitiated as he sees it by a culture which seeks to crush individual thought. These themes, though born in a time very different from our own, carry with them deep resonances which are pertinent, it seems, to our own culture. Schweitzer was never really interested in the collective. His whole battle was a battle against the absorption of the individual into society in a way that would mean that individual could not think and arrive at conclusions that he thought the individual would arrive at if they did think and were given space and time in which to think. Schweitzer's philosophy of reverence for life is a striking attempt to argue for a view, or perhaps it would be better to say an attitude of mind, which he sees as reflecting the internal yearnings of the human being. Reverence for life, then, is not a command from outside, but the unveiling of a predisposition which is assented to by thought. Schweitzer's Nietzschean insistence on the need for ethics to reflect human personality, but at the same time have a universal applicability, that's the Kantian bit, may seem unrealistic, indeed bound to fail, but it is an aspiration with which people can sympathise. Schweitzer's monistic sense that all life is bound together, gleaned, I would suggest, from the reading of Schopenhauer and Indian religions, leads to an ethic which envelops the whole of creation, which is deeply critical of what Schweitzer takes to be the predominantly anthropocentric view of ethics, which has been dominant in the West. Such a vision obviously chimes in with a world strikingly conscious of environmental depredation. This was recognised early on, and it is striking, for instance, that Rachel Carson dedicated her hugely popular and influential Silent Spring of 1962 to Albert Schweitzer, quoting his words, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end up by destroying the earth." What some have seen as the absolutism of Schweitzer's ethics, that all life must be preserved and no life destroyed, can of course be mocked, as can his failure to provide norms for making judgments as to when killing is justified. But Schweitzer's absolutism and failure to create a raft of criteria for judging when killing was valid or not arose, I would suggest, from a desire to A, retain the individuality of each ethical decision. Each ethical decision is something you arrive at personally. And B, to deepen the attitude of mind he calls reverence. What reverence for life does is deepen and make more thoughtful a sense of human responsibility without imposing a set of glib rules. Or as Heike Baranski has put it, reverence for life is not a principle of justification of ethics, but a moral psychological principle of sensitization for the formation of the acceptance of responsibility. This gives it a complex, open-ended character, to some even a dangerous subjectivism, but it also imbues it with a quality which impresses upon people the need to eschew complacency in the making of ethical decisions. Schweitzer's philosophy takes seriously the complexity of life as it is. As with Schopenhauer, his is not a philosophy which arises from speculative engagement with the world, but with the world as it is, a complex mixture of goodness and beauty, cruelty and ugliness. His rejection of the possibility of a Weltanschauung, a world view, and his embrace of a form of resignation in the face of this, constitutes a wholesome acceptance of a kind of realism. But for Schweitzer, resignation is not about passivity, but rather a liberating concept. Precisely our acceptance of the world's mysterious mix of good and bad, but our acceptance of the oneness of creation, of our place within it, an interconnected whole, leads to action in spite of the absence of a worldview. Schweitzer's is a bold attempt to avoid the pitfalls of types of speculative philosophies and to embrace a kind of activism based upon hope, which is embedded in the ethical predisposition of humans in the face of mystery. In the end, I would suggest, such a claim has a theological basis, and that may be its Achilles heel, but it is a vision that aims at hopeful realism. The human is in the world, but must move out of the world in order better to act upon it. An extension of his point, as Ulrich Kirchner has argued, is to see Schweitzer's ethic as a protest against what Charles Taylor, in The Sources of the Self, has called disengaged reason. That is a form of reason which deliberately breaks with ordinary corporeal experience, and in fact does violence to it, by conceiving of the sensual world and its phenomena as something disenchanted, as mere mechanism. Schweitzer's thought, as Kirchner has argued, can be understood again as a protest against disengaged reason. What I suppose must remain true in the end is that Schweitzer's concerns resonate with ours, the thoughtlessness of modern man, which goes hand in hand with a mass mentality, narrow specialization, superficiality and lack of spirituality, along with the mechanization of nature and the depersonalization of humanity. These are the deepest indications, Schweitzer said, of the decay of civilization and have a resonance surely now. And that even if his moral vision can be questioned at numbers of points, the urgency with which he argues his case, and the manner in which he seeks to develop a sense of human responsibility, an engaged ethic, as it were, is strikingly relevant. There is also a sense in which Schweitzer's philosophy becomes more powerful because he attempted to live it out. He felt bound to do so because of his views about the relationship of thought and action. He always liked quoting Goethe, am Anfang war die Tat. At the beginning was the deed. Right, I want to just say now something about Africa, because I think this goes to some extent to the core of some of the difficulties. How much more time have I got?
As long as you feel comfortable, that's fine.
Okay, another 20 minutes, would that be okay?
That would be
People
fine.
aren't totally bored, right? Schweitzer, then, in spite of the difficulties and unfinished nature of his work as a philosopher and New Testament scholar, remains bothering with, mainly because of the suggestive impulses of his work. In many ways, these are necessarily impulses, because Schweitzer never had the time to finish any of his projects, to refine them and make them into something more coherent and satisfying. That was, as Pick makes clear in the quotation I gave you earlier in the paper, because he decided, for reasons which are still debated, to leave the world of academia and music and to become a medical missionary in the Gabon. I want to spend some time on this aspect of his life because to some it is precisely the reason why we should bother with him, and for others the reason why we should not, or the reason that makes it less easy to bother with him, except as a kind of relic of an imperial vision of benevolence. Let me make a number of points. Without Africa, Albert Schweitzer would not have become the iconic figure he did, especially in the late 1940s and beyond. It was the tale of the brilliant young organist and scholar leaving the possibilities of conventional fame to become a medical missionary that was the core of his appeal, whatever other reasons may have played their role. Without Lamborghini and what it symbolised, both about Schweitzer, about the beneficence of colonialism, about the possibility of redemption after a nihilistic world war and so forth, Schweitzer would have ended up another probably marginal academic, successful but within constricted contours. One finds this point repeated from a very early stage in writing about Schweitzer. Oskar Kraus, the Czech philosopher who wrote a small book about Schweitzer, was critical of his philosophical writing and was clear where his real importance lay. The world, Kraus maintains, is rich in people who have achieved things in varied and specialised fields, but it is much more limited in examples of selfless characters, in men of ethical will who have served as beacons for others. Schweitzer arrived in Lamborghini a severe critic of the effects of colonialism. This is seen in particular in sermons delivered between 1900 and 1913 and his departure to Africa. From an early stage, he conceived his work there in terms of atonement for the terrible effects of the white man's presence. His views would subtly change over time, no doubt as a result of living in the Gabon for a while and being frustrated by the behaviour of some of the local population and seeing the insidious effects of the colonial system upon colonialist and colonised. All this becomes clear, it seems to me, in the communications he writes from Africa. This is not to say that he ceased to think of his actions as atonement, that he did not remain ever conscious of the evils of the colonialist system, but he did come to see the colonial system as inevitable, even preferable, to the internecine tribalism which preceded it. The colonial powers were of course not there to exploit, they should not be there to exploit, but of course they were, and make war, but to educate the people of the Gabon and elsewhere to a better way of life, and to one which would lead to their eventual independence. In these circumstances, the relationship between the white colonizer and the black colonized was of the older to the younger brother. This view of the relationship between the two parties of such a system meant that when Schweitzer was faced with the clamour for African independence, which began in earnest in the 1950s, he was opposed to it, believing that Africans had not reached that stage of civilization which would enable them to govern themselves independently. Such views came to be seen as anachronistic. Indeed, as early as 1944, the well-known American black activist W.E.B. Du Bois, in a remarkable article that appeared in the Albert Schweitzer Jubilee volume, while praising Schweitzer for his work in Africa, made it plain that Schweitzer had failed to think outside the colonial box. As he wrote, after quoting Schweitzer on the right of Europeans to colonize primitive and semi-primitive people, he had, with all this no broad grasp of what modern exploitation means, of what imperial colonialism has done to the world. If he had, he probably would have tried to heal the souls of white Europeans rather than the bodies of black Africa. Jeune Afrique, found in 1960, Jane Rauch, in an article entitled Le Scandale de Lamborghini, did not portray him as a doctor, but as the epitome of a colonist who came to Africa only because of greed, power, and fame, and who governed like a despot. And more recently, Chinua Achebe, the well-known African writer, has accused Schweitzer of committing outrageous blasphemy in his depiction of Africans and being an out-of-touch anachronism. Achebe identifies a pernicious paradox that a saint like Schweitzer could prove more troublesome for the African than King Leopold II, precisely because of the rationality he introduced into the separation between white and black in his own colonialist mentality. Into this mix can be added two further criticisms: that Schweitzer ran his hospital in a tyrannical way and ineffectively, and secondly, that in accord with his views about Africans as the younger brother, his attitude towards Africa was one of aloofness, a point hinted at in Achebe's comments. It's not my intention to explore these accusations in depth. There is, it seems to me, less substance behind one, that's the two I've just mentioned, the one about the hospital and the aloofness one. There is, it seems to me, less substance behind one than there is behind the other accusation. Schweitzer may have run his hospital in an authoritarian way, and some of his strategies may have been thought eccentric, but it remains the case that the hospital was demonstrably the most effective in Gabon for some time, that many were treated in it, and that the French authorities' especially sceptical and critical attitude towards Schweitzer was fed by a jealousy at his success. These are helpfully confirmed by the massive book by Rita Hedrick on medicine in that part of the world, and Hedrick has a number of very interesting observations about Schweitzer which are broadly positive about his medical contribution. The second accusation is more substantive. Schweitzer never learned one of the admittedly many languages which form part of that area of the Gabon. He had little developed interest in the local culture, whether religious or even musical, and one thinks, for instance, the question of African primitivism, the works of André Gide, on these kind of things just did not interest him. And unlike other missionaries, he did not see Africa as providing solutions to the cultural malaise he conceived as endemic in the West. There is a kind of trope in some missionary literature which sees aspects of Africa and African culture as showing up as reflecting very badly upon the way we live in the West. Indeed, for Schweitzer, by and large, solutions to the Occidental crisis he had outlined so harshly were to be found among Occidental thinkers, among Kant and others, amongst people that he knew well. And it is perhaps ironic that while he was in Africa, he wrote books on Indian and Chinese religion, not on forms of African religion, either in their indigenous form or in the ways in which they blended with Christianity to produce transformed versions of the latter. One thinks, for instance, of the Bawiti religion in the part of the world he came from. And of course, we can compare him unfavourably in this regard with his successor, Robert Hamill Nassau, who wrote on fetishism, learnt the languages, and became thoroughly imbued in the culture. Although he could admire the ethical disposition of those he worked with, report with a sense of admiration their disbelief that Europeans could engage in such destructive wars, and comment sympathetically on some of their customs, particularly things like polygamy, which he was quite understanding of, unlike other missionaries, he did not see Africa as providing material for Western renewal. For Schweitzer, it was necessary to escape the prose of Africa, I quote, which was by and large conceived negatively, and one did that by taking refuge in the work of thinkers of the West and sometimes the East. This sense of aloofness, as some claim, was reflected in Schweitzer's decision to have Europeans eat separately from the native Gabonese, a form of apartheid he even came to regret. I dare say we should have fewer difficulties with our savages, he writes, if we could occasionally sit around the fire with them as men and not merely as medicine men and custodians of law and order in the hospitals. But there is no time for that. We have been sentenced to carry out the fight against illness and pain as a demanding trade which makes everything else fall short. And from his generally sceptical views about educating the native population, at least before they had reached a level of civilization which made them properly receptive to education. In such a view of Schweitzer, and it is one that has been particularly eloquently expressed by Professor Ruth Harris of the University of Oxford, Africa never really interested Schweitzer in its particularities. In this respect, his universalism and quest for an absolute ethic seems strangely opposed to the postmodern emphasis on particularity. Africa was more a means of escape from a European world, not least a European academy, which made it difficult for Schweitzer to think and act creatively. Or put differently, Africa became the place where Schweitzer enacted his almost Nietzschean ethical will. Ethics, after all, was for Schweitzer the activity of man directed towards securing the inner perspection of his own personality. Beyond that, he had little developed interest in the Dark Continent.
Harris's views was already being touted before Schweitzer's own death. In an article in Der Spiegel in early 1960, the correspondent Klaus Jacobi had made a not dissimilar point. Schweitzer's interest in Negroes, he writes, is apart from healing virtually absent. Just as he writes a book on the worldview of Indian thinkers, which is admired in India without ever being in India, so he spent an admired half of his lifetime in Africa without learning a native dialect and visiting only one other country except Gabon, namely the Cameroon. However one assesses these variant analyses of Schweitzer's involvement in Africa, it remains the case that Schweitzer's involvement there, the nature of his utterances about those he treated and about decolonisation, and his wider attitudes, make him a subject of contestation, and potentially in our current world, with its particular preoccupations and concerns, a rebarbative figure, or at least an alien one, representing outmoded views and attitudes. As I have said, I have concentrated on Schweitzer's involvement in Africa because to some it is precisely the reason why we should bother about him, and to others a reason why we should not. The matter is complex and responses will depend upon the presuppositions of those who investigate the problem. An Africanist will see the situation differently from a certain type of Christian. African perspectives will differ from some European ones, and so forth. Let me draw a number of conclusions from this discussion of Schweitzer's African involvement. Schweitzer's incrementalist approach to African independence, his benign colonialism, if that is what we are to call it. And it's interesting in this respect that Dubois said that Albert Schweitzer was neither deceived nor enlightened. He saw the pain and degradation of this bit of God's earth as something he could alleviate. For many years he gave his life to it, a kind of juxtaposition of two things there. His perceived aloofness from the cultural environment in which he found himself, as well as other, perhaps more disputed facets of his activity in the Gabon, mean that he cannot be a figure who, for instance, is a contributor to the question of African development, or indeed a figure who sits easily in developing discussions of that continent's future. As an African figure, or a character in the history of Africa, he will always be a figure of controversy, a man daubed in the vestiges of a particularly problematic past. Like his Jesus, he betrays, perhaps inevitably, the contextual baggage of his age, and that in spite of the fact that he sought to live in a way that was different from that world. Even if, relative to many who participated in the colonial experiment, he emerges much less sullied than some, and of course he didn't come to exploit, he came to heal, etc. But does that mean that Schweitzer should be discarded, not bothered with? Again, like Schweitzer's own Jesus, there is something to be saved from the African experience, for there remains, it seems to me, extraordinary strength in the fact that Schweitzer sought to live out his own ethic, precisely through his activities in the Gabon. How will we conceive of these in terms of their consequences and their motivations? As Hannah Arendt wrote, here discussing the example of Socrates, who refused to escape death in defense of his views, the teaching by example is indeed the only form of persuasion that philosophical truth is capable of without perversion and distortion. By the same token, philosophical truth can become practical and inspire action only when it manages to become manifest in the guise of an example. This is the only chance for an ethical principle to be verified as well as validated. To some extent, this point relates to the truth of a claim, but it also touches upon the power of example. Lamborghini was Schweitzer's attempt to enact a vision. Its power lay in the fact that it represented embodied action. The particularities of its contribution to Africa can be disputed, but its purpose and aim can only be disputed on the basis of a striking censoriousness. And that, it seems to me, is where the importance of Schweitzer's activity in Lamborghini should be located. Conclusion. Why bother, then, with Albert Schweitzer? Where should we locate his lasting significance and his ongoing importance? In this paper, I have made a few tentative suggestions. There is a power in the story of Schweitzer's life, not simply in its disputed dramatic aspect, but also, it seems to me, in the often fascinating way in which it reflects significant elements of the late 19th and first 60 years or so of the 20th century, in a variety of intriguing and absorbing ways. Just as the tendency to see Schweitzer over against the world of which he was a part, rather than embroiled in it and reflecting it, can lead to a rather austere vision of the man, so a view that sees him very much within that culture gives greater life and vigour to him. I have also suggested that Schweitzer's intellectual and academic projects merit attention in different ways, and that whichever way we look at him, his thought, philosophical and theological, remains problematic in various ways and definitely incomplete, as Schweitzer himself admitted. Schweitzer then is not a compelling figure because of what he thought, even if the impulses which come from his theological and philosophical works remain compelling. What makes him a striking figure, what will perennially attract people to him, just as they were attracted to him in the period before the following World War II in particular, and continue to be, was his activities as a medical missionary, which could be understood as the culmination of a highly sensitised ethical imagination, indeed the embodiment of his own intellectual activity, where action took over from thought. It was precisely this element of Schweitzer's life which led Karl Barth, who had spoken negatively about Schweitzer after their first meeting in 1928, this was their only meeting, to ask in the final lecture of his career, very interesting, this is the final lecture of Karl Barth's career, whether, in fact, academic theology was not in some sense a luxurious pursuit, eine Luxusbeschäftigung, says, which takes us away from the living God rather than allowing us to engage with him. And whether it was not Schweitzer, here, that most problematic of theologians, who, in choosing to heal the sick, feed the poor, and give drink to the thirsty, had, from a theological standpoint, chosen the better way. But even during his own lifetime, Schweitzer's activities in Africa had come to be questioned on a number of grounds which may seem to some more actual and significant in a world ever sensitive to charges which imply exclusion or prejudice. Schweitzer's rise to prominence was to some extent the consequences of context, as too was his partial fall from grace. The fact that he is not so well known now is not just the result of the African dimension of his life. His popularity, after all, was itself predicated upon a world hankering after a moral hero in the wake of a nihilistic war, and its contextuality cannot be overlooked. The question with which we are faced is whether a man who once bestrode the world like a mighty colossus can do so again, or at least begin to do so, or if not, become the starting point for a movement and inspiration for an age different from his own. In his pith helmet, his commitment to the pursuit of a universal ethical truth, his unreconstructed belief in the individual and suspicion of the collective, and his benign colonialism, which saw the relationship between white and black in paternalistic terms, he can seem like his Jesus, an alien and a stranger. But there is enough commonality between Schweitzer and our concerns, environmental, ecological, internationalist, even pluralist, enough, it seems to me, in the example he set, in the striking nature of his achievements for a single life, to mean that the strangeness can be overcome, and that with his failings, Schweitzer can still be an inspiration of sorts, seen particularly in his striving, however incomplete, to enact his ethical vision. He is, as Chichavatsky has argued, a gadfly who confronts us with the view that the world will only save itself if the individuals who inhabit it change, and he does this without offering an instant reward for the demanding changes he prompts us to undergo. To be human is to be responsible to a degree which is demanding, even exhausting. To live in the world, we must, like Jesus, live as if we were not in it. It is precisely the challenge of the Schweitzer Institute to become an effective advocate for that challenge, with all the difficulties that potentially entails. Thank you.